Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership Center series on leadership development plans. Last week, I introduced the urgency of leadership development and why it should not be postponed. A soundbite would be, you have a 90-day window to set the tone for a person's interest and pursuit of development. The context is a new employee, whether it's a leader or entry level. After that point, it's either an upward trajectory or drops to an identity and habit-aligned plateau. Today, we go deeper into what actually holds leaders back from operating at the highest level consistently. And I'll do it by looking at how excellence is created, whether in sports, special operations, martial arts, or business. Using the brain's design, which hasn't changed in the last 200,000 years or so it's a good foundation. There are millions of ways to do a thing, but only a few, sometimes just one, process design that rises to world class. And here's the so what. It isn't a lack of intelligence. It isn't a lack of ambition. More often than not, the barrier is invisible. It's the network of neurons in your brain that's been conditioned by past experiences, reinforced by habit, and strengthened by repetition. We talked about the pre-stimulus phase and how that's constantly priming us through our 33,000 decisions per day. Change the pre-stimulus, you change the state of being. And a different state of being means different outcomes for some of those 33,000 decisions. Now here's the big shift. What many call the subconscious is more accurately described as your network of neurons. This description makes it clear. It's not a separate mind. The impulses traveling through your neurons are energy patterns. They seem like thoughts because conscious thought is also energy, but with meaning added. When we learn to direct and rewire these patterns, we move from living on old associations to creating in a way that is aligned with your vision or life design. Think of muscle memory. What we really mean is nervous system memory. A boxer doesn't think about throwing a punch. Their neurons fire faster and cleaner because the pathways perform at a high level because of deep practice. The same system that wires athletic performance also wires your thoughts, priorities, and decisions. That's why I say the same neural architecture that drives physical precision also drives mental performance. Why leaders get stuck? When you face a challenge, your nervous system doesn't always present you with the best option. It presents you with a familiar one. If you're stressed or pre-fight or flight, it's a familiar one, but one that's based on survival, like for life or death. That's why leaders fall back on limiting beliefs, outdated responses, or reactive patterns. Even when they know better, unless you deliberately intervene, those associations harden into identity. This is also why creating a new identity is so difficult. Each time you approach a breakthrough, you hit old set points. They trigger fear, doubt, anxiety, stories. The brain is wired for survival, so it pulls you back toward the comfort zone. But here's the key. Through neuroplasticity, neural pathways can form, and do form, often solidified simply by sleep and reinforced by action. That's why I tell people when they're getting that cognitive dissonance that occurs when they're going across the line, stop worrying about it, stop working on it, get a good night's sleep, let the neuroplasticity happen. And the next day, you wake up with new ideas, with a newfound inspiration to plow through. That back and forth loop of challenge, reset, and renewal is what allows you to push past barriers and grow into the next version of yourself. But you have to be taking the steps in the action, and then you need the reset time for the neuroplasticity. It's why proponents of 10X can so confidently tell you that yes, it's possible and it's within reach. Whether they knew what was happening in their brain, they activated this process of neuroplasticity as a result of taking continuous action. It's my belief why so many success stories begin after a person has hit rock bottom. Now, hitting rock bottom is not necessary, but the process of hitting rock bottom makes them let go of the old self, which is what happens as a result. And I think letting go of the old self is necessary. That's why I call this the reset that works. You let go of your old self, but you also skip the breaking down that comes, for example, from military special ops training. Think Navy SEALs or Army Rangers, or maybe what happens in the martial arts where the first few belts, they're breaking you down. This breaking down does the same thing. It allows you to let go of your old identity. And it's embedded in my reset transformation process, which I'll cover in depth at the workshop next week. It's out of scope for today, but it'll be covered in full in the workshop. In fact, I spent 90 minutes on that 7-step reset module. Now, the good news is that this system is teachable and it's repeatable. And what I'll cover in depth in my upcoming transformation workshop, you can apply as a leader, as a coach, or as a trainer. Through neuroplasticity, we can generate new connections, reinforce new habits, and redirect responses at the stimulus reaction level. Change doesn't have to be slow. With the right tools, you can interrupt an old groove and lay down a new one almost instantly. And this is where leadership development fits in. Leadership development is not so you can get good at developing leaders. It's so your organization can become great at executing your strategies and achieving your goals. Today, I'm going to illustrate how similar thinking is to physical action and why the conditioning process is essentially the same. There's an initiative phase, carrying the signal from the brain to the central nervous system and beyond. There's a transmission phase, delivering that signal to the junction where the muscle is. And there's a vehicle for the transmission, the billions of neural pathways carrying the signal between the two. The process is essentially the same, certainly in a layman's terms. Obviously, neuroscientists will have different labels that they put in there, but the overall design is the same. And I'll call it a junction between the central nervous system and the neural pathway, and the junction between the neural pathway and the muscle is the same as it is for thinking, except that junction has a different function. The neural pathway does the same sort of thing, energy patterns flowing through, and then the junction between the neural pathway and the muscle, in the case of thinking, agreeing, disagreeing, making a decision, moving forward, having self-doubt, whatever that is, there's a little loop in the junction. But you don't need to know the names of those the same way you don't need to know how a car is designed or built to turn it on and drive, and that's the point. So whether it's throwing a punch, leading a meeting, or making a decision under pressure, the same rules apply. The narrower the gap between intention and outcome, the more effective you become. Now, why is this important? It's the outcomes that are possible when you command this process. Imagine consistently replacing self-doubt with clarity, real time, intercepting anxiety spirals, and better yet, eradicating them completely before they even start. Returning to calm in seconds. Imagine modeling that kind of control for your team, not with slogans, but through deliberate actions, priming, mindset, and targeted habits that directly shape the outcomes that you desire. A side benefit is that once you understand the mechanisms and can apply them, you are also equipped to influence your team in ways that can upgrade their performance, sometimes instantly. That's what happens when you understand the nervous system as both the barrier and the lever. In this session today, I'll cover enough so you get a sense to see how it works, and then I invite you to attend the workshop, which I'm having on Thursday. And that's where it'll be covered in depth, and you'll walk away with the skill. Today, you will definitely understand, and if you want to do the research yourself, you'll be able to figure it out, but it's beyond the scope of a 45-minute talk. Now, the transformation workshop is going to be about 3.5 hours. That's where you'll learn to align nervous system memory with conscious intention. You catch the old pattern as it activates, interrupt it in the moment, redirect it into a state that's aligned with your goals, recreate your default mode so the above automaticity works in favor of your life design. This is the same principle special ops soldiers use to stay calm in chaos, the same principle martial artists use to stay fluid under pressure, the same principle that elite businessmen use to expand what's possible for their teams, even in the middle of chaos. Today, I'll lay out the design so you'll see how it works. And if you are in this business or you've done a lot of this work, you'll be able to put the pieces together just from looking at the design. So here's a quick recap. If Talk 1 was about urgency, Talk 2 is about the roadmap to excellence. Excellence doesn't come from grinding harder or memorizing hacks. Those obviously contribute. It comes from learning how the system actually works and then calibrating it deliberately. Hacks don't work because homeostasis is always seeking to stabilize, so the hack gets neutralized in favor of stability. Think the way it's always been done. By approaching it through the lens that I'm advocating, the possibility that you unlock is that you begin creating from the powerful present moment, and you find you are no longer hijacked by inconvenient developments. I'll illustrate this so you can have a mental picture of all of this without the neuroscience terminology, which often seems to confuse things. So let me do a quick recap first of what I covered last week, where I was talking about the urgency of development plans, or having a development plan, and more importantly, getting started. Remember, I'm not advocating development plans for the sake of getting good at leaders, unless, of course, that's your business, but it's about executing strategies and achieving goals. So what I said was that we have, and this is kind of arbitrary, but I'll call it a T minus 30. So if we call T the day that they start, we have a T minus 30. And in this T minus 30, you probably have the final interview. Maybe they have to do some drug testing, and they'll be updating you on what happened with the drug testing, some things that they have to do, documents they have to get you, whatever's happening in this period of time, you have an opportunity to message. And then out here, there's a T plus 90. And then further out here, there's a T plus 180. Now, the way I talk about it, in this pre-start period, we have, this 30 days. Their expectation is pretty high. What I'll have to connect the dots here without getting into the neuroscience of it all. We know that dopamine is a habit formation neurotransmitter, and we know that serotonin, they call that the feel-good neurotransmitter. When a person is about to do something new, their body is excited, their internal system is excited, and they have more dopamine and more serotonin going through. So they have an abundance of dopamine and serotonin, which means excess, which means a stronger signal. To put it in context, if you hear about a weightlifter talking about hitting a plateau, those plateaus are largely neurotransmitter signal related, not so much muscle related. So when the signal from the central nervous system to the muscle gets weak, they're going to have a plateau, and that's the homeostasis where it's stabilizing. Now, when they start, they're on high alert. They're looking for what's important, what about meaning. They're attaching meaning to things. They're listening. They're learning their new skills. They're taking the courses that you have laid out for them. And done right, we can see that their expectation and their reset and their development mode kicks in, and they go on a nice upward trajectory. A little backfilling, but it's going to be an upward trajectory. This could be, I know in sales we used to use a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And these are the number of days that you meet that week. So the first week you meet 5 days, second week you meet 4 days. This is a way of extending that, and you keep them going. If you don't do this right, it's very easy, and by default, if you just let them alone and you think you're going to come back and you're going to have them read some manuals and then they're going to learn by doing, which worked in the past, but things are moving too fast now. You need people who are not operating on habit. You need people who are operating because they learn quickly and they can apply it. But if you're not careful and you're not proactive during this period, what can happen is the brain is very efficient and it loves to take shortcuts. It's going to find out what's absolutely necessary and do just slightly more than that. Now, depending on how you're wired, right, in your whole life, maybe you do a lot more than what's minimally required, or you do just under what's minimally required, or you do exactly. I mean, you're going to be, right, you're either going to be somewhere around here or somewhere around here, depending on, and that's your wiring. That's why I said you default to an identity-based and habit-based plateau. And that's where you ride out. Now you could ride this thing out for the rest of your career. But if we do this with what I'm advocating, development plans in such a way that we're moving people up, the same way a martial artist moves from white belt to yellow belt to green belt to blue belt or brown belt or purple belt, whichever, depending on the school, then black belt, and then first degree, second degree, and third degree. And let's say that happens over 2 to 3 year period. You can actually map this to a kind of development plan. If it's an entry-level employee, obviously you know what the first 6 months looks like, and it's not hard to figure out the next 12 months. If it's an experienced person with a lot of leadership experience, It may take some creativity, but it's not difficult. And here's why. I'll use an example of the dental hygienist. And you can apply this to many things. Most of us have been to more than one dental hygienist. I've moved several times. I've had different ones each time, and they speak the same, they use the same tools, they do things the same way. Now, why is that? It's because that there's a standard. They have one way of doing something. They learned it in dental school. It gets upgraded slowly, but there are upgrades. Like if I look at what the dental hygienist talks about today versus what they talked about 40 years ago, there's some nuances, but it's essentially the same because they came up with the best practice because the body works the same. And if they're talking about gums and teeth and what have you, there's not a big change. They might discover a few new things. So again, it's nuance. It's not wholesale changes. When it comes to leadership, we don't have that. With leadership, there's command and control, there's servant leadership, there's participative leadership, there's leader as coach, there's different metaphors, the family metaphor, leaving out of a political metaphor, leading out of a friend metaphor where we just all get along. And people get results through all these different metaphors, and so it's always debatable. There's always 10 possible leadership strategies, and if I tell you it doesn't work, you can point to an example where it does work. This is why I use research. When it comes to leadership, I like to get as close to what I call it a near principle, because I can't really come up with principles because people are different, but I can come up with a near principle. And in other words, it's going to work 99% of the time, because of the research that went into it. For example, if you look at Liz Weissman's multipliers, you look at Jim Collins' Good to Great and Great by Choice, you look at Stephen Covey, Habits of Highly Effective People, these books have so much research and so much real-world application behind them that I call them near principles, because you're not going to recreate that without doing an equal amount of research. And until you do that, I'm just going to use what we already have. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. So when you look at it that way, it's no longer debatable, and now I can sit down with you, or you can sit down with your senior leadership team and come up with what are the skills. And skills are activity-based, but they're also thinking-based. So for example, last week I talked about MISI, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. Having that understanding that of being able to apply MISI. How about a brainstorming? There's multiple ways of doing a brainstorming session, but there are ways that work much better than the rest. What about problem-solving models? There are many people who love jumping into solving the problem right away. Using a problem-solving model. The first step of just about every problem-solving model is something like clearly define the problem. So we want to have consistency, and those are at the leadership level. Now there's other things. How do you do a checkpoint meeting? Here's what's interesting I observed is that if taken across all things being equal, poor or weak employees have had more checkpoint meetings than highly successful employees. The people who are highly successful, getting promoted ahead of their peers, tended not to have checkpoint meetings because checkpoint meetings were something that leaders thought of as a negative. And that's partly because of the way they were used and how they're invoked during performance management plans, etc. But if you understand, checkpoint meetings are no different than having a sports team having meetings in between games. Those are checkpoint meetings. And if the defensive coach works with the linebacker and then it works with the cornerback another time, or safety, whatever, that conversation is a checkpoint. So there's a way to perform checkpoint meetings. There's also a way to do succession planning. You know, there's the how and the what. The what is the results. The how is how did they get the results, and using whether it's frameworks or matrices or models or whatever. It doesn't take long to figure out different ways to have a baseline for what every one of your leaders should be able to do. They should be able to talk to the public and customers. They should be able to deal with a crisis, even if it's a mini crisis. I wouldn't manufacture one. I would wait till one shows up and then have them work on it. So that's the idea of what we want to do is have a 2-year development plan for leaders, and there may only be touch points every 6 months, or there may only be 4 touch points. They may have a list of things that they've got to accomplish, and then they come back and report back. But there should be consequences if it's not done. In other words, they do it again. It doesn't have to be major. They just have to do it again or do it until they get it right. Now, I talked about how the brain and physical activity, or how cognitive and physical activity are very similar. So let's say we have the brain, sends a signal to the central nervous system. And what I'm doing here, I don't want to introduce a lot of terms. One of the challenges I have with neuroscience, because it's in such the infancy. I mean, we didn't even have brain scanning tools that we have available today. They didn't start showing up until like 3 or 4 decades ago. And it's been accelerating. The more we've learned, the more those tools accelerate. We can tell more what's going on in the brain and nervous system than we ever could, going back hundreds of years. So neuroscience is really in its infancy, and there's a lot of new terms. And when you're doing research as a scientist, one of the things you want to do is get peer reviewed. And so there's a challenge because they have to use the language that's been already proven. Otherwise, you have to do more research to prove that point. That's a simplistic way of looking at it. Without adding new terminology, because if I have this conversation with the neuroscientists, they're going to be adding new terms, which I agree with. Those other terms exist. There is other stuff happening from the brain to the central nervous system, but it's not pertinent to this conversation. Then the central nervous system has what I'll call, in this case, just a junction, and that junction sends information to a neural pathway. And that neural pathway, the signal that goes through the neural pathway, is received by another junction that passes it on to the muscle. So this is what happens with physical activity. You learn how to hit a pickleball, you learn how to jump a few steps, you learn how to scramble in hiking, you learn how to do a golf swing, whatever it is. This neural pathway is created, formed, strengthened, optimized by deep practice. Then let's look at cognitive. In the cognitive view, we have the brain, we have the central nervous system, we have a junction, a little bit more complex. Then we have the neural pathways. And by the way, there's 100 billion neurons. Each neuron is connected with anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons. And those neurons fire and wire together. And so you essentially have trillions of connections of neurons. Trillions and trillions. 100 billion is a lot. And to have 100 billion of them, and each one is connected with 1,000 to 10,000 others, you get the idea. So this is not just one neural pathway, and it's not neural pathways with 4 neurons. There's, could be tens of thousands of neurons in a pathway. But there's another junction here, which is a little bit more complex, because now it's going to consciousness. So that consciousness is where we are doing the real thinking. So here we have an energy pattern that's going through there that can be misinterpreted as thought, because it's energy, and thought is energy. But this consciousness now leads to, maybe it's agree, maybe we disagree, we act, hesitate, doubt, we're inspired. I could go on and on and on. But you can see now how what a person does follows along, the outcome follows along the same pattern. Now, we tweak it a little bit because of this extra thing going on in the junction, and we have to tweak it a little bit here, and this is why I have my 7-step process. So in the 7-step process, and I covered that last week, so you can go and look at last week's. It's on my LinkedIn events section. It's the first module of this series. My 7-step process covers this section, and this by itself is steps 3 to 7. So steps 3 to 7 covers what's going on from the time it leaves the central nervous system to the time that it's into consciousness and we're taking the action. Steps 1 and 2, well, it doesn't really fit with this drawing, but steps 1 and 2 have to do with pre-stimulus phase. Consider getting bad news while you're already stressed out compared to getting bad news after you've meditated. And you get the idea of what pre-stimulus is about. And then we have state of being, or state. And while it's similar to pre-stimulus, the reason this is step 1 and this is step 2 is because there's things we do in the pre-stimulus step to stack the deck in our favor so that we would have a positive state of being, high energy positive. In the state of being, there's things we actively do to maintain that state of being, keep upgrading it, or if we get knocked off course, to get back quickly. You've seen people be in a good mood and then they get triggered and they get into a negative, a fixed mindset, and you can't get them out of it. They can't get out of a fixed mindset. That's the state. That's what we want to do here, is be able to go back to the growth mindset, not in days or hours or even minutes. I'm talking seconds. That's what we do in the state of being. That's why it's a 7-step reset process, because no matter what is happening, we're going to reset. Now, here's the cool thing about it. Whether you're talking about cognitive or we're talking about the physical, and in the cognitive, I'll take the triggered state out, because if we're talking about normal, regular stuff, from here to here is about 500 milliseconds. So half of a second from here to here. As I mentioned, because there's more complexity here and here with the cognitive, in a fight or flight situation, in a stress situation, we need an additional 90 seconds. The reason we need those additional 90 seconds is because we have to modulate the emotion, and we want to do the modulation of the emotion before we take action. All right, that is the nutshell of why I say that we can approach cognitive change very similar to how we create or address change in physical activity, and it's why deep practice works for both. And like I said, it's beyond the scope of here because there's other layers I need to layer in, which is why I'm spending 90 minutes on the workshop. So there's one more part that I want to cover. So we had these neurons, right? And I drew them like this for a reason. And these, well, from a neuroscience standpoint, we could debate and argue, and it's going to be different, and the neurons in this part of the brain are different from the ones in that part of the central nervous system. It doesn't matter. If I spell cat with a C-A-T or I spell cat with a K-A-T, while K-A-T is incorrect, it's close enough that everybody knows what I was talking about, and this is all I need to actually take place. If you don't understand the difference between fuel injection and carburation, it's not going to change how you start the car. You're still going to get in and start the car. If you're driving a diesel and you call it gas, it's not going to change how you drive the car. You better figure it out before you put fuel in there, but driving the car is no different. Now, what's happening here is when we wrap with myelin, that's the first one, myelin. When we wrap these with myelin, and that's done because of deep practice, these neural pathways fire stronger, faster, more precision, and improved timing. So not only are they faster, but the timing is right. And the difference between doing this well or doing it in just regular neural pathways without the extra, it's the difference between a 75% free throw percentage versus a 25% free throw percentage. If we were to look at the myelin on the amateur who's doing 25% free throws, there's no myelin on there, very little myelin, it's just normal stuff. These people here have highly wrapped neural pathways, and then when you take the 90th, 99th percentile people, they have a lot of myelin. Now, myelin doesn't reduce much with lack of use. It does degrade over decades, but I'm not going to talk about that. What I want to talk about is how it does not degrade with lack of use. So the second part of this is that in between here, we have neurotransmitter. And with lack of use, neurotransmitter does go away because the brain is stingy. Now, remember I was talking about that first 90 days, or that first 30 days, and the first 90. So the reason, okay, so it's 30 days and it's 90 days, which is 120. If you were to just do a Google and say how much, what period of time is a person's neurotransmitter production heightened when they get into a new situation, it's going to tell you 60 to 120 days. That's where I'm getting this. And obviously, the more you do, the longer it's going to be. But the reason I say that this exists, because when you go into something new, especially if you're positive and looking forward to it, you get more of the neurotransmitter production. That neurotransmitter production gives the brain the ability, or gives the body the excess neurotransmitter it needs to fire these neural pathways. Now, what makes this neural pathway stronger than this one? One of them is the myelin. The main one is myelin. But the other one is the neurotransmitter. And the neurotransmitter, as I said, it does go away with lack of use. So that person is practicing all the time in the gym, playing games with themselves, doing like what Steph Curry, I've heard it said that when he's shooting his long shots, he's not, or in practice, he's not just shooting to make them go in. He's looking at the hooks on the net to see what part of the rim he wants to come in from, what part it goes over, etc. So he's adding deep practice. He's adding levels of complexity to something that was just there. So by adding more complexity, by adding more intentionality, by adding more precision, by tying it into progression where you're doing more, first it's 3 in a row, then it's 4 in a row, then it's 5 in a row, by adding, I think I said complexity, and then by adding bursts. So maybe speeding it up and say I need to get 7 in a row within 5 minutes of shooting. So now you've got some intensity going, you've got the progression going, you've got the burst going, and then it should be struggle on the edge of ability. So that struggle at the edge of ability is picking those hooks on the net. So it's one thing to make the ball go in, it's another thing to make it go in over this particular hook, or to hit the backboard over that hook and come back into the rim. That's an example of the struggle at the edge of ability. So I just went through 7 factors: the novelty, intention, precision, complexity, progression, intense bursts of intensity, and then struggle at the edge of ability. This is what makes deep practice happen. This is what makes the myelin happen, but it also generates neurotransmitter. So by doing that, we're activating these things with neurotransmitter. Now here's what's interesting. Myelin takes a long time to develop, and it lasts a long time. Neurotransmitter develops very quickly, it's produced very quickly, and it runs out very quickly. This one requires deep practice. This one requires those 7 factors that I talked about. I just ran through them quickly. But when you have novelty, intention, precision, complexity, progression, short, intense bursts of intensity, and then struggle at the edge of ability, what you're doing is communicating to the central nervous system that this thing is important and that it needs to produce some more neurotransmitter, and that's why you get this, and that's why they can stay here, because you're constantly flooding the body with neurotransmitter. So instead of homeostasis, which brings them back down to the low plateau, we're keeping them in allostasis, which keeps it moving up here. Now, I did mention that the idea of 10x. When we talk about 10x, so you can think in terms of a person, they're moving along in their comfort zone, right? And then they get inspired and they break out. Now, something happens when they get into this area above the comfort zone. In here, I mentioned you have your stories, habits, beliefs, you have energy involved, you have successes, because it could have been successful and still cause resistance, because maybe you were so successful that that's the only thing that you can do. That's the only way that you can do it. It's like the football player who's still wearing the same socks 8 years later because he had his best game wearing those socks, and he's wearing the same socks or putting his headband on the same way. It's locked him into only one answer, and we run into this because people are resistant to every other good idea because they've locked in their mind that the only way to have success is that thing. And then there's other pieces as well, obviously, triggers, phobias, and things like that. So now, when they go up here, typically what happens is they end up coming back down, and they get back to homeostasis, right? What we want to do is show people how, what I do in the workshop is show them how you keep going. You break through it. This is what I was talking about, letting the neuroplasticity happen. There's so much cognitive dissonance in here. So much cognitive dissonance is going on because you're breaking through stories, you're going through past beliefs, you're doing all of this, and you're not supposed to be able to, so you get this cognitive dissonance. And because excitement and anxiety have the same signature in your body, the excitement gets interpreted as anxiety, and then because neurons that fire together wire together, they start looking for other associations, and next thing you know, you're in an anxiety spiral. Because you were almost about to break through, it dumps you into an anxiety spiral. And then eventually, you will break out. Now, here's what's interesting. When you break out, it's not over. Because After you've broken out, something else happens. You now are in the field of infinite possibility, which means everything is unfamiliar. And in the field of infinite possibility, where everything is familiar, you have the potential to fall into stress. I've had this happen. I've had people triple and quadruple their production, and then it freaks them out so much, they end up having a massive episode where they just fall all the way back down here. Now, what's good is that they've already been there, they've seen it, and they can move back up. But the interesting thing about this work, which is why I have another area where we work through the identity shift, because you don't know where that next identity break is going to happen, but it can happen. And ideally, if you know all the things in advance, because out here you have VUCA, right? You've got all the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity going on out here. And then over here you have real threats, you have imagined threats. And so there's always stuff going on. And what we want to do, and this aligns with Jim Collins, keeping it simple, and the hedgehog concept, we're going to have a very narrow path. This is where the principles comes in. That's based on what I call near principles. So we don't have to worry about all the threats and the opportunities and start chasing shiny things. We are going to stay focused, and when the opportunities come, we receive them. When threats happen, we know how to handle it. But what we're going to do, we're just staying between these two lines. We're staying between these lines of following what I call near principles and near principles, because you know that if you do that, it's going to work most of the time. And when it doesn't work, we've got the skills because we've had the reset to where you'll know what to do next. That was a lot today. Next week, I'm going to map across examples using martial arts progression, like through the belts, and I compare it to Shaolin monks, who it's more thought to be cognitive and emotional based, whereas I'll use Taekwondo, it's more physical kicks and things, so it's very physical. But you'll see those two, and I'll talk about it in the context of what a development plan looks like. So progressing from a white belt to a black belt or 10th Dan black belt is a development plan. And so is going through the levels as a Shaolin monk. So is learning to hike from category 1 to category 4 type hikes. It's all development, and what we'll do is show how we can move between physical development and use what we've learned there and what we know how to do there, which we call muscle memory, but it's actually nervous system memory, and how to apply that deep practice over to the cognitive side. All right, we will see you next week.